Cindy. A big warm welcome to Derek Cook, who is visiting from kind of all over, but
it's the East Coast.
East Coast. A bunch of us met him at Wanderlust and all were instantly just infatuated. He's absolutely brilliant. Don't read his bio because it doesn't even touch on how brilliant he is. And so we just want to do a quick Q&A of some of the topics that he can discuss, but again, like, he has a breadth and depth of knowledge that I hope we can keep bringing him back for. Today, we'll talk about myofascial release, fascia mobility versus stretching, and anything else wacky that comes up. So first, I would love to just have Derek introduce yourself and share a little bit about you.
Hi everyone. So yeah, my name's Derek. I'm based out of DC, New York, East Coast world. And we met in Wanderlust. Which one? Wait, were we?
We met at Whistler. Megan and
Whistler.
Jenna met you at another Canadian event.
In Canada.
Canada.
Yeah, and so my background. I'm a body worker, I'm an anatomy teacher and biomechanics teacher. So and yoga teacher, that too. I get super fascinated in the body and the way the body works and the way, what we can do with it, the potential of us as people. And a few years ago, I really, maybe 8, 9 years ago now, I really sort of started to dive into anatomy, physiology, and I studied with a structural integrationist, which is a style of body work. You might know it as Rolfing, which I'm not a Rolfer. Rolfing's kind of a school of structural integration, it's like a brand. KMI is another brand of structural integration. But what we do as body workers is try to help people organize their body in a way that is efficient and healthy and more easeful, just to move about your everyday life. So I started to get interested in that style of body work. I started to study Pilates, and then from there really found a passion for anatomy and got into teaching anatomy for movement professionals, so yoga teachers, Pilates teachers, strength and conditioning coaches. And then in that, I started to study with a guy named Gil Headley, who many people, if you're a movement person or have taken a yoga training or a Pilates training, it's not, it wouldn't be crazy if you'd seen this video out there called the fuzz speech, which is where most of us come into contact with Gil's work. And he's an anatomist who runs these global dissection labs. So I finally went into his lab a few years ago and started doing dissections with him, which took me down, I thought I had gone down a rabbit hole of anatomy. In my previous life, I was an engineer in theater, so I got really interested in how things work, how they're put together. And then I was able to translate that into how body works and how it's put together. So I went down this crazy rabbit hole. I started studying, working with Gil a lot over the past few years, doing these, what you call global dissections. So sort of looking at the body as a whole, looking at it layer by layer, system integrated with system. So that got me into, one day we'll get there, that got me into fascia, which is Gil's big, not only interest, but a big interest of Gil's, fascia, connective tissue, this stuff that sort of permeates the entirety of our insides. From there, I got into doing work with myofascial release, or sort of structural myofascial work. Yeah.
So good. So I have heard fascia. Well, first of all, why should we even care about fascia? Start there.
If you care about your body, or you want to be able to move it, or it to do things like, breathe and to everyday bodily functions, fascia is going to be involved in that. Fascia is literally everywhere in the body. Directly underneath your skin is a complete, uninterrupted suit of connective tissue, of superficial fascia. The next layer is another layer of fascia called the interstitium, which houses things like lymphatic fluid and interstitial fluids, which are amongst other things the body's waste removal system, cellular waste removal system. Fascia creates the scaffolding for all of your organs It is the scaffolding of the musculature. It's the structure of bones. It's literally everything. Yeah, so if you want to use your body in any sort of way or have your body work in any sort of way, you're going to be working with, in one way or another, fascia. So getting to know more about it can help you to understand how you work, how you're put together, how to heal things, how to strengthen things, how to grow things. Yeah.
I've heard it described as when you open up an orange or a grapefruit, kind of the like the inner layer before the fruit. Would you agree, disagree?
Totally. That's the, so I love the citrus fruit analogy of the body and fascia, because you peel off the skin of a citrus fruit, and on the underside of it you have that white, fibery stuff, which would be related to us as superficial fascia and adipose tissue. But it's not, the cool thing about the orange or the citrus fruit analogy is it's not just that.
Mm-hmm.
In between each wedge of an orange is another layer of fascia. And you keep going, and in between each sort of like pulp, every piece of pulp is a fascial lined container that contains the essence of the orange. So it actually it permeates and invests through our entire body the same way it does through an orange. So you peel the skin, you've got your superficial fascia, and you could even think of like those wedges as a muscle, and that muscle has its own fascial container. And the muscle inside of any given muscle has more compartments, more delineations, and they've got their own fascial containers. So yeah, it's a great way to visualize it.
Okay. So primarily at Practice Indy, we are a yoga studio, and we do a lot of basically stretches, strengthening and stretching. And then we have our component of CrossFit and Swift, where stretching may or may not be useful to that demographic. And so I want to help people understand the difference between stretching and mobilizing, and also like myofascial release. Can you delineate those three things from one another?
Yeah. So we'll do we'll do a super introductory version of those sort of worlds. Stretching by definition is passive. It's a passive lengthening of tissue. So, and I will say some of this too is semantics, and so
Right.
Many people might be referring to mobility work. They might be saying stretching when really they're meaning mobilizing, and so to get a little bit of clarity around that language could be helpful. Stretching by nature is passive, so it is using either outside forces, a block, a prop, a rail, a ring, something to put passive tension on tissues. Mobility is an active process. So mobility is engaging musculature and then finding its range of motion or its length. Both are, I would say both have their values, both have their advantages, and it really depends on what you're trying to do in your life that will help you to decide which process, which way you want to go. So if you're trying to go for big ranges of motion, if you're trying to go for, I love the analogy, and if you've ever taken my training, you'll hear this, I say it probably every time. But if you want to drop down into a split, that's passive, that's stretching, that's flexibility. If you want to find the length in a standing split, so with like your hands on the ground, 1 foot on the ground, and one leg up in the air, that's mobility. So you need to be able to, it's like, what do you have active control over the range of motion for? That's when you're talking about mobility. You have passive range of motion, stretching or flexibility. In yoga, we've, we'll get to myofascial release too. In yoga, we've pretty traditionally thought of it as stretching. And if you're looking for like, how big of a back bend, how deep can I get my pelvis in an anjane, how, can I get my private parts to the floor in a split? That, that's really like the historic, the sort of new historic viewpoint of yoga. Where we are now in modern postural yoga, we're sort of, and I feel like this probably started to really change in the zeitgeist 10 years ago-ish. There wasn't like a date, but like, about a decade ago, people
March
started
1st.
to get, it was March 2009.
2009.
Yeah, it was a great day. they started to realize that passive stretching is potentially problematic for the tissues. It's where we can go or exploit we can exploit hypermobility, which if we want to talk about, so if we want to get into semantics again, the term hypermobility is kind of cheating, because if we're calling mobility the control of ranges of motion, hypermobility isn't. So there's a guy out there who calls it hyperflaccidity, which I think, while sounds weird, is actually a really a nice, clear way to put it. But excessive, uncontrolled ranges of motion can start to put strain on structures that aren't ready for it. If you think about, your joints, the things that hold joints together, like help to align the articulations of bones, are ligaments. And if you go past the muscular control of a range of motion of a joint, and into the passive control of that joint, you could be putting stress or strain on ligamentous tissue that is unlikely that you've prepared it for that. So in the yoga world, we probably went a little too far in the ranges of motion. We probably saw these pictures of, 14-year-old Indian boys putting, legs behind their heads and smiling and said, like, ooh, I should do that. And the truth is, those boys were, and if we want to be honest, were like shoved into positions from a young age that grew their bodies in a way they could do that. B, they have genetic predispositions to ranges of motion in their joints that like a white dude like me doesn't have. So if we look at those pictures of classical asana and then try to contort our bodies into those pictures, we're likely having to go into some of that flexibility, that passive range of motion, which what we've learned over time is the potential to do damage. So nowadays, the yoga world, the smart yoga world, is the nuanced yoga world is getting more into the mobility side and participating, controlling, engaging through our big ranges of motion. So that would be kind of my quick sort of discussion of the difference between flexibility, stretching, and mobility. And then when we get into the term myofascial release is a type of body work, whether it's done on yourself, which we're doing tonight, or whether it's done by a practitioner on a client, that works to sort of interact with the fascial networks and layers so that it gives us a little range of motion or a little more range of motion in whatever kind of movement we're trying to do. The term release gets complicated. That's a whole long story. What's actually happening? You're not actually lengthening fascia. We're not getting fascia to release. So myofascia means muscular fascia. Myofascia is the relationship, is the system that involves muscles and fascia. Myofascial release would be releasing the system that involves muscle and fascia. You're not releasing it. You're not getting a particular fascial connection to lengthen. Often what we're doing is we're starting to break up inappropriate relationships between fascial planes or sheaths. We're getting the central nervous system to allow musculature to go into bigger ranges of motion. We're getting blood and lymph and fluids and hydration into places that didn't have it, which gives them a little more mobility. But yeah, so myofascial release is again a kind of sloppy way to describe using a tool, whether it's a foam roller. Foam rolling is another form of myofascial release. A foam roller, a self-massage ball, something like one of the clients who was in the class I took last night was talking about something he just got called a sew right, which is a cool little tool. A tool or a body worker's hands using a tool to encourage more potential range of motion. Does that make any more sense? Is it?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, it does to me. I don't know about you.
You'll let us know, I'm sure.
The last question I would have you, we talked about that you are an internet ordained minister.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I loved that we talked about yesterday was something I'm so interested in is that we are this machine. It's deus machina versus the divinity within the machine. And so I would love to hear your perspective or take on how you see both the mechanics working with the divine. Just simple.
Yeah, just like real easy.
question.
No, but it's such a good question. When I grew up, I was going to be a priest. Like, I grew up in the Catholic Church. I was like tried and true altar boy. I was like in it. And there's some, and I know really well that like search for the divine. I through the own pride, like left that whole desire by the wayside when I got into high school. But the desire to become a priest, not the desire to find God. That search, that like seeking, I think is inherent in, us, these like gross bodies, these like earthly things. And when I started to, you don't need like my whole life story, but I'm happy to tell it all the time. When I started to get into movement and anatomy, I found that search again, and I was like, oh, this is like, what are we? Like, who am I? And I found really fun places to look in my own experience of moving, in my own experience of being a body. Then when I got into doing dissections, it really clicked. And I will say, like, if you start to look inside a body, obviously with consent. But you cut a body open.
Body snatchers.
Yeah, there is no way not to see the beauty and the divinity and the complexity in the form that we are, in this completely impossible existence. So getting to celebrate that, getting to play with that, I don't know, that means a lot to me. It means like it's hard to be attentive and pay attention and notice what's going on and not find some like real beauty in it. I think the more you pay attention to what's happening in your everyday, the more precious you make it, the more beautiful it becomes. And then you play with it, and that's, I think, one of the things that yoga is like taking this like cool thing we've got and playing with it and experiencing it. I lived in India for about a year, and when I was in India, I found Tantra, which is also Kashmir Shaivism, and the first two sutras of the Shiva Sutras are Jaitanya Atman, which means Jai is like celebratory, victorious. And Atman is absolute consciousness. So it's basically saying like everything in existence is a joyful expression of absolute consciousness. Not even just like, and it's, and the cool thing about like, if you we can go into real down the rabbit hole. If you look at the old text, if you look at any of them, the Kabbalah, the scriptures, if you look at the Quran, the old texts, they all basically say like, we are sons of God, right? Mm-hmm. But what Tantra, you can take it back even further, we are of God. So we're not like, Tantra says, and I'm a big believer, we're not creations of the divine, we are the divine, created. We are this like esoteric into physical form. The second of the Tantras says, Gyanam Bandhaha, which means that knowledge of the details is bondage. So and then it says everything is divine. Like this floor is divine, that locker is divine, that painting is divine. Everything is just God, whatever, the great wolf, the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to call it. But everything is divine manifest. Understanding that locker is made out of metal and this floor is made out of concrete and this shirt is cotton and you're, carbon. Understanding that confuses the fact that we're all divine. It's bondage. It takes us away from that understanding. But the other 72 sutras or tantras go on to explain the universe, because Tantra also says, in order to remember this one very simple fact, you have to go and learn all the details. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as you learn the way the universe works, you'll realize that it doesn't matter, because that knowledge took you away from the simple truth of you're divine. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I got into this, like, I want to know everything, because I realized that like knowing everything will remind me that none of that's important.
That was so beautiful. Thank you. Sarah Strother, who we had last weekend, she said something that really stuck with me because I have always heard devil's in the details, and she said God is in the details.
Yeah,
and that like really struck me because I think both, you know, depending on your language, it's a language barrier, but both can be true. Like we need the light and we need the shadow, but they all roll up to the same thing. Like if you're from a Judeo-Christian background, like Lucifer was.
He was an angel, and not just an angel. Like he was the guy.
Angel,
yeah.
Right. So it's like. Just like changing that language that yes, like when we get really granular, it does actually pull us away from the larger truth, but it can also illuminate us back and to see that God, both God and devil are in the details of both the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, so good.
Well, thank you. We're so honored to have you here and hopefully have you back many more times. And thanks for watching.
Thanks, y'all.